After days of repression, protests, and unrest in several Iranian cities, the dagger came out with the execution of the British-Iranian ex-defense minister Ali Reza Akbari and a 22-year-old Kurdish woman who was arrested for breaching the Iranian dress code. Violent protests began throughout the nation, and for a moment, it seemed like Tehran might have played with fire, until the fierce Revolutionary Guard got things under control using its favorite weapon, brutal repression. It was then that the geopolitical landscape reverted back to its favorite rivalry, Iran versus the West. The events were followed by sanctioning of Iran by the EU and the UK, trying to contain Iran under the Code of Human Rights violation. But who knew that the situation would aggravate up to a dangerous extent, and the EU-UK coalition will have to taste its own medicine? Following the persecution of Alireza Akbari, anti-government protests took place across the country. This caused the Iranian government, already exhausted coping with protests across the country, to impose a deadly crackdown against the anti-state protests. This mere action of shunning the protesters was enough for London to impose 50 sanctions on the Iranian regime. These events are the indications of some serious deterioration of relations between the West and Iran, which might have some serious implications for the region's peace in the future. The new sanctions are putting restrictions on foreign trade, financial services, energy sectors, and technologies, and included a ban on the provision of insurance and reassurance by EU insurers to the state of Iran and Iranian-owned companies. The big shock came when Mahsa Amini, amid protests against the dress code, was arrested by the Iranian morality police and died in their custody, which rocked the Iranian society to the bottom, and the protests gained speed. It sparked a heated stance against Tehran, whether politically or on social media, and it was enough for the West to revert back to its favorite weapon, sanctions against Iran, in order to weaken its geopolitical status and economic growth. The tragic death of Mahsa Amini has caused Iranians from all walks of life to mark one of the boldest challenges to the ruling theocracy since the 1979 Islamic Revolution led by Ayatollah Khomeini. Iran accuses Western powers of fomenting the unrest, which security forces have met with deadly violence. As you guys might have already guessed, there's no conflict complete without the US coming in with its might, and it was then that the US adopted a firm stance against the Iranian regime. Following the tragic events that took place, the US stepped in and sanctioned the powerful Islamic Revolutionary Guard, which has been one of the most influential organizations in the Islamic State's upheaval. But this organization has been at the heart of the tensions between the two nations. Washington has accused the IRGC of continuing to aggressively crack down on peaceful demonstrations across the country, and said it has played a pertinent role in suppressing protests through extensive human rights abuses, which is extremely disgraceful. Now, this might be a strategic move by the Biden regime. Sanctioning the IRGC can be critical as it is the key economic pillar and usually funds and controls the majority of brutal suppression imposed by the Iranian regime. Let's not forget that the IRGC was set up shortly after the 1979 Islamic Revolution to protect the Shiite clerical ruling system. It has an estimated 125,000-strong military with army, navy, and air units, and commands the besieged religious militia often used in crackdowns. But what happened next made the situation even more tricky for the Iranian regime. The European Union stepped in and announced its arrival by imposing 30 new sanctions on the Islamic State. More than 30 Iranian officials and organizations, including units of the Revolutionary Guards, blaming them for a brutal crackdown on protesters and other human rights abuses, were sanctioned by the EU. During a meeting held by the 27 foreign ministers of the EU, a conclusion was made that the Iranian regime had to be dealt with accordingly and no rash decisions are to be made, and the aggression came in the form of sanctioning of the senior officials of the IRGC, an organization of utmost importance for the Islamic State. The new sanctions were imposed on 18 people and 19 entities altogether. Those targeted will be restricted to travel to the EU, and any assets they hold inside the bloc can be potentially frozen and dealt with. Some EU governments and the European Parliament have gone as far as making it clear that they want the IRGC as a whole added to the bloc's list of actual terrorist organizations. But the EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, noted that could only happen if a court in an EU country determined the IRGC was guilty of terrorism. Next in line was Britain again, imposing more sanctions this time, but Tehran wasn't going to sit back and watch everything happen. This time, they had to retaliate. Iran didn't hold back long and came in with some of its own sanctions. In a retaliation move, Iran announced fresh sanctions against dozens of individuals and entities affiliated with the European Union and the UK. Not only that, but the sanctions imposed by Tehran include the blocking of accounts and transactions in Iran's banks, along with the prohibition of visa issuance, further damaging the relationship. These sanctions came 2 days after the sanctions imposed by the EU, and a list of 22 individuals and 3 entities from the EU were also included in the sanctions list, along with 8 individuals and 1 entity from the UK, stirring up some heat on both sides. After imposing some of its own sanctions, Iran has shown the West that it won't hold back and won't hesitate to retaliate if the West tries to interfere in the domestic affairs of the Islamic Republic of Iran and fomenting violence and unrest and dissemination of false information about Iran. No doubt that the sanctions imposed on the Revolutionary Guard by the US and the EU might come as a big blow to Iranian sovereignty, but Iran has given the West some of its own medicine in an attempt to impose some serious sanctions. Iran, like always, has locked horns against the mighty West, but what lies ahead might redefine the course of the future forever, because there are some key decisions by either side that can prove vital in this battle of sanctions. Freedom of protest is the right of every citizen, but at the same time, interference in the domestic or foreign affairs of a state is disliked throughout the globe. Global politics has 2 of its giant blocks standing against each other, and it is all in the line of tactics, policymaking, and appropriate actions that can prove absolutely crucial in the days to come. This has stirred up debate across the analysts throughout the globe. We've also uploaded a video on the rising tensions in the Middle East and its implications on other countries for you guys to follow up. So make sure you watch that video, because it explains how the Middle Eastern political landscape will affect the wider world. So what do you think about Iran being sanctioned by the EU and the UK? What implications will it have for Iran? Let us know your point of view in the comments section below. Make sure you press that like and subscribe button, and if you do like watching videos related to geopolitics and business, then make sure you push the bell icon, and we'll see you guys in the next video.